Good evening, everybody. Hiya. I'm Rose Lejeune. I'm the director of Performance Exchange, which is kind of new organisation that was supposed to have its first edition of a series of performances across contemporary commercial galleries in London last summer. This summer just gone, obviously has now been postponed until next summer. But the idea was to firstly stage a series of performances across different commercial galleries, and then to work with museums around the UK to support them to each kind of collect a work from the programme, and to really be thinking a bit more about what that kind of cross-sector market and museum kind of collaborations might be, but also how to think about expanding the art market and talking about the relationship, I guess, between kind of multidisciplinarity and all sorts of different kind of materials and ephemeral practices, and the way that they get represented and supported and kind of collected in different contexts. And so since lockdown, we've been doing a series of different conversations in partnership with the David Roberts Art Foundation that originally we came together both as organisations that had performance at the kind of root of our interest, and to think about how to support and how to talk about event-based practice at a moment when it was really clear that there was going to be a long time until we could all come together and actually experience those kinds of practices again. And so this is part of that series, and we've got a whole kind of extra set coming up in the future that will look at different performance histories and thinking about some of the ways in which the representation of those kind of practices has changed. But tonight I'm really happy to have with me Ben Cook from LUX and Carolina Ciuti from LOOP in Barcelona, and both of them exist, I think, really to support artists moving images, the artist moving image through the not-profit and kind of market mechanisms. And it was a really good opportunity to talk about something about the kind of economics of practice, but also this idea of medium specificity, and how we might think about the kind of importance of medium-specific curating, distributing, collecting, and in that sense think about how those mechanisms kind of respond to this idea of a changing nature of artist practice, and what the kind of economic and kind of curatorial formats that they offer have in common, and how they distinguish themselves from kind of broader public and market sector practices. So just to say that please feel free, obviously, to type any comments and questions into the chat, and we will try and kind of incorporate them as we go. And you can do that either through the chat function or through the Q&A function, and I'll be kind of keeping an eye on it. We're really happy to kind of turn this into a conversation right from the very get-go, so do feel free to get involved. I wanted really to start off by kind of contextualizing some of this conversation within a little bit of the history of the two organizations, LUX and LOOP, just to think about kind of why it was necessary and useful to set up those frameworks in the beginning, and maybe take us through a tiny bit of kind of where we are up to where we are now. So I thought I might start with Ben, just because LUX is really kind of like the oldest of the three organizations, and has this kind of history that I think takes us through some of those things. And he's very kindly kind of agreed to give us a very quick kind of overview of LUX and some of those kind of different iterations. So I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you, Rose. Thank you, Rose. Hi, everybody. Okay, so yeah, LUX in its various iterations has been around for the last 53 years. So it was founded originally as a London Filmmakers Co-op in 1966. It was founded originally as an artist, as a cooperative, an artist cooperative. So with a kind of open membership, and basically anybody could become a member of that organization if they had a film. And basically your film was your membership card, basically. And so it had this, it was very much the kind of, the values from the beginning were very much around this kind of cooperative model, you know. So there was, everybody had one vote, the jobs were shared among the group. And that's really important, I think, in terms of maybe some of the things we're going to talk about today, because some of the impetus around the setting up of this organization was obviously to address a need. And that's something I think about even now, like, what is the need? You know, it's a constant question we ask ourselves. And I think the need in the 1960s was obviously access to the means of production. So to be able to make films in the 1960s was pretty much impossible outside of the film and television industries. So it's about sharing equipment, and it was about developing a kind of a language for a kind of practice that wasn't really represented in the art institutions of the day. There wasn't really a kind of valuing of this type of work. It was kind of homeless, and there was no kind of discourse around that as well. So those were some of the important founding principles, but also this idea of a kind of resistance against the what some of the members saw as a kind of singular competitive practice, studio-based practices of working with mediums like sculpture and painting and things like that. And so there was also this kind of utopian idea of film as a kind of a collective practice as well. And that was very much in the model of the original organization, almost this kind of, where it came out of the arts lab movement, which is kind of akin to kind of factory, maybe Andy Warhol's factory or something like that. This idea of a place where creative things could happen, where ideas could be shared, skills could be shared, and together. One of our founders, Malcolm LeGrice, he talked very inspiringly of this idea of how ideas would come from the screen. So they very much resisted this idea of competitive ownership of ideas, but rather this idea of a kind of collective progression of thinking through a practice. And the organization from its early days was also very invested in this idea of what they called integrated practice, which is this idea that a practice encompasses all of its elements of making and circulation and exhibition within the practice. So there's a lot of reflexivity in that idea that you can't make a film without showing a film, without circulating a film. So that really set the model for the organization that we are today, that idea of integrated practice, that we see a direct connection between this idea of a practice and its means of circulation as well. And there's a kind of conceptual way of looking both ways with those things. We can't separate the mechanics of that from the kind of concepts that we're working with. And okay, still in 1966, but I'm just going to jump forward a bit, but I'm just going to really zoom up to the present day. But 1976, our second predecessor organization came into being, which is called London Video Arts, which was basically, which came out of an exhibition at the Serpentine Gallery called The Video Show, which was the first kind of big video show in the UK. And this is a really interesting exhibition because it was like an exhibition at the Serpentine of like installations and workshops and performances and things like that, and it very much captured the instability of the medium at the time, and about this idea and a kind of instability around what was video practice. So there's quite a lot of connections between that and community-based practices, performance practices and things. So it's really, really fascinating to see what the kind of iteration of this show is in terms of how it kind of tried to encompass all of this instability, this kind of instability, which kind of crystallized and became more institutional later on. And then the next kind of critical moment is these organizations eventually, so film and video, I mean, for the younger people in the audience, there used to be two things, film and video, and like literally, almost like the people that work with those two mediums hated each other sometimes. But, they were very, very different kinds of practices, with a whole different like groups of artists, whole different kind of discourse, a whole different relationship to art institutions really as well, and a whole different sense of a kind of a context of where they were coming from. If filmmakers were resisting cinema, then video artists were resisting television, and because until the early 90s, if you were making video, you were working on monitors, so there was a kind of sculptural element to these things as well. You couldn't get beyond the monitor. Yeah, eventually these organizations merged into an unhappy organization called the LUX Center at the end of the 1990s, and it had a custom built building in Hoxton Square. It just before Hoxton Square became like fashionable and White Cube moved in and things. It existed for 3 years and it had its own cinema and gallery and production facilities and things, and it went bust because of the area became very, very expensive very quickly, and then the organization started to from the beginning again, and that's where I kind of become properly involved in terms of setting up LUX in its current iteration. And just to say, we describe ourselves as an agency for the support and promotion of artists working with a moving image. We see ourselves very much in a discourse, in a visual arts discourse. Okay, so we don't actually, even though we encompass a lot of histories which are kind of anti-institutional, oppositional. In some ways, part of our project is trying to draw the connections between these different kinds of cultures. But we see our home very much in visual arts, and very much in a trajectory of visual arts discourse. It's just because of the specific demands of film and video or moving image media that we exist because of its own particular needs, which I'm sure we'll talk about. So, sorry.
No, it's really fascinating. I mean, I was thinking as you were talking, I was thinking, about that moment of something turning up in the Serpentine and kind of exactly that sort of that being like, okay, so something gets set up because there's a real need not only to support the means of production, but presumably because in the mainstream institutions there's no kind of knowledge of how to just really practically work and display these things and think about the way that they get produced and presented. And then the Serpentine show, which is a fairly kind of mainstream, although at that moment maybe not the Serpentine that we know now, comes along and kind of puts it on, and that actually shows in some ways that it has started to become part of the conversation, but also catalyzes a whole new organization being necessary to kind of develop and continue that. But also that moment of the kind of 90s or the very late 90s is the moment, Carolina, where Loop gets set up and tries to take that and takes that conversation not only into this idea of the festival, but also thinking about how that sits in this newly flourishing market, which is also the kind of Hoxton Square in London. Hoxton Square is a kind of like a real node of the art market really kind of changing and being visible. So I wonder, Carolina, could you pick it up in 2003 and give us that sense of where Loop kind of fits into it?
Yeah, so Loop was founded in 2003. It's a teenage project compared to LUX, but at the moment it was still the only fair that was solely dedicated to promoting moving image works. And it was born out of the will of 3 gallerists, all based in Barcelona, to create an event or a space for a debate around a medium that was yet to be institutionalized, let's say. And them as galleries felt the need also to, have a space to reflect upon the modes of production, distribution, and circulation, selling and buying video works, and that's why they thought of a fair. So Loop was initially born out as a fair, and it was celebrated in a hotel because one of the main preoccupations that directors had was in regards to the viewing experience. What are the best conditions to, exhibit video in a commercial event, in a commercial context? Of course, the fairs, as we know them, are a hectic environment, and video and film, on the other hand, required the ability to stay with duration, to experience time. So the idea of a hotel setting was related to that, like different rooms that converted in gallery booth, and that would host just one video by one artist. So really giving the time to all the visitors, being them curators, other artists, galleries, collectors, to really experience the offer. At the beginning, the selection ranged between 30 to 40 galleries, and that model is the same today. The only thing is this year it's going to be a special edition because, of course, for the COVID limitation, we were forced to relocate the fair in a different venue, not a hotel. It's going to be a museum, so it's going to be much more like an exhibition kind of fair in the way it's set up. But then to go back to the beginning of the project in 2003, it was the fair, but then a few years later, they thought also of a festival because they wanted really to contextualize the fair in a broader context, the context of the city of Barcelona, collaborating with all the institutions, commercial galleries, artist-run spaces to really put for a program dedicated to move an image from different perspectives. And one of the interests of Loop has always been to, cross boundaries, the boundaries between moving image or video art, as someone might say, and cinema or experimental cinema. So among the collaborators of Loop are also a lot of different cinemas in the city. And of course, Loop has a wide network of international partners. So when the festival was born, then they felt the need also to create a space to debating all these issues that we might call the modes of film production. And so the talks program and the professional meetings program was born. So these three are the three events that or proposals that make up Loop as a whole. That of course Loop is also a platform that runs throughout the year. We do collaboration with different entities such as LUX, other distributors. We've collaborated with Video Data Bank, or institutions that have a specific attention to moving image.
And what's just to ask a quick follow, what's the relationship between the fair and the festival, in the sense of obviously the fair is a fairly standard model in terms of you have a gallery that represents an artist that shows that work, but the festival is kind of is wholly independent as a kind of curatorial model to that, or those two things are linked?
Well, so the fair takes place the festival lasts 2 weeks, and the last 3 days of the festival is the fair. So of course there are the audiences overlap, and sometimes also we try to better contextualize the presentation of a gallery within the festival. So for example, if there's an artist who we are particularly interested in, we also program that artist in the context of the festival. And that was the case, for example, in 2016 of Malcolm Legrais, who participated with Richard Sultan in the fair, his gallery, and he also did one of his performances at the MACBA in the context of the festival. So we try to build bridges between the two events, and the festival is much more curatorial, a curated selection, and we either curate the project ourselves with our curatorial team, or the institution that we've been collaborating with throughout the years propose us, a screening programs or exhibition dedicated to moving image according to the specific theme of the festival, which every year is different. So this is basically the functioning of the two events. And then of course there's the talks program that kind of joins the two.
Ben, I just wanted to ask you something quickly to kind of follow up on that, because Carolina mentioned it, and I think it's a sort of third node in this, which is if you could say something about in more detail about the distribution model that you work with now in terms of the way that you kind of support artists through the collection.
Yeah, sure. So I guess it's a funny model that seems anachronistic at certain points, but I suppose it's based originally on more of a kind of film industrial model, this idea of loaning works for screenings when people would hire those works to show those works. And in a way, I suppose that was the basis of the organization from the beginning, this idea of building up this collection that was then loaned on behalf of artists. And I suppose how this, you know, one of the things that is kind of interesting about this model over the years is how it interacts with the art market. So, and that's when it caused some problems in this kind of, it did actually cause some problems in the kind of crossover period of the what I think of as, this period of the 90s when like the commercial galleries particularly started to engage with moving image works and try to kind of understand them. And so if you think about kind of the art market is very much based on this model of the object and based on the limit, the auratic object, you know, and the value of the encounter with that object. Then obviously how kind of moving image fits into that is quite sort of complicated. And so the original thing that happened was that people have kind of adopted this model from kind of prints, you know, from printmaking and from photography, where basically works would be editioned in a kind of series, and that's how works are sold to this day. They're sold in limited editions. And obviously this is a kind of an slightly artificial kind of construct, because the original kind of editioning system was based on the idea that it was related to how many times you could copy something before you got a degradation in the quality of the copy. So kind of what does it mean when you can copy something infinitely? So that model that was the kind of model that was adopted. And what's kind of interesting about our model is that there are still many people that find that aberrant, that idea that you would edition moving image works, because like one of the really important things in the DNA of this area of practice is this idea of democracy and kind of anti-institutionalism, anti-capitalism, the idea of kind of radical kind of access, you know. So if you think about, a lot of artists originally in the 60s and 70s came to working with these mediums because of those kind of impetuses. They wanted to work with something that inherently kind of resisted the kind of marketization of art. And so in the 90s, there was this really desperate attempt to kind of nail these things down, and there's lots of really funny examples of things like Matthew Barney. You could buy a Matthew Barney work, a laser disc in a mahogany box, and things like that. You know, so you know, a lot of galleries still struggle with that idea of the ephemeral, and there's always this attempt to kind of weigh things down and make them kind of you know, like objectified somehow. Then something kind of what's kind of happened in recent years, which I think is really interesting, is that there's been a kind of a gradual understanding that actually the value of moving image works don't necessarily come from exclusivity. They don't come from limiting the auratic encounter with the work, because they're an ephemeral thing that doesn't exist. You know, it's dematerialized. It doesn't exist in the world. If you keep it away, if you don't materialize it enough, then it kind of gets forgotten about. And so actually I think there's actually an inversion to the value model of traditional kind of art world value, in that it can actually like decrease in value a work that is not. And also I mean, I always quote people like David Joslet, you know, that in this funny book After Art that he wrote, which to me is still like a really useful book, where he tries to understand where value comes from in the kind of in the age of kind of networked art practices. And he talks about this model of like a kind of a metaphor of kind of almost like a charge that things get from contact and charge. So this idea that actually value is built by the amount of references that are made to works, and the context in which it is encountered, and the connections that are made around that work, and how these works need to exist in this network. So to me, that's a very kind of inspiring idea of trying to articulate what this new kind of value system might be. And so now what we work with a kind of a hybrid model now, where we both work with a lot of commercial galleries in terms of like enabling the kind of edition system to exist. But how Lux works now in terms of the editioning system is that we describe ourselves as, we have a contract with the artist to distribute their artist proof on behalf of the artist. So the things we distribute are not for sale. They are actually basically the artist lending something to an institution through Lux. Okay, so it both maintains so it both maintains the kind of integrity of the edition model. And however you feel about this editioning system, I can kind of understand it from the institution side in some ways, because if an institution, you know, a serious collecting institution is going to invest in a work, then they want to know, like, you know, I mean, a positive way of thinking of collecting is always, for me, about stewardship. This idea that you are taking on a responsibility, you know, and I think if you are taking on a responsibility, you need to know, you know, where it is in the world, where that thing is. You know, I think the idea of not an uneditioned work, you could describe it as either being everywhere or nowhere. So so that's why I guess I've gradually come around to this idea of the edition, alongside this idea of works being able to circulate freely at the same time, because I think of moving image works as like performances. You know, I think they are fundamentally performative, and they need to be performed, and a structure like Lux enables those performances to happen. You know, I mean, if you know anything about like the collection loan system as well, it's like very bureaucratic. The inter-museum loan system, okay, it's super bureaucratic, it's very slow, it's built for like very high value, expensive, delicate objects, okay, and it's completely not appropriate to circulate fast-moving, network-based, performative objects like films, okay. And so that's why an organization like Lux exists, and other sister organizations that we have around the world exist to enable that flow of works in a system.
It's really interesting because, I mean, in that sense, it's exactly that. There is a real relationship with that history of performance in terms of that anti-institutionalism, anti-commercialism, and certainly with the kind of research and work that I'm doing around collecting performance, it can be a similar criticism, which is the criticism of like, but this is the one thing that shouldn't be commercialized. This is the one thing that should be free of those kind of market. And for me, there's a really interesting sort of almost generational shift around the economics and the way that we understand, you know, the way that practice gets made, the way that practice gets distributed, and also for me, this idea that that so much of artist practice these days is kind of multidisciplinary. So it's not that one person is only a performance artist or only a filmmaker or only a ceramicist or only a painter, but they're making across that kind of constellation of mediums. And that if you say, well, that's collectible and that's collectible, but that has to disappear and that has to disappear, then you zoom out from that and the whole practice doesn't really make any sense. So it's also kind of, how do you hold an entire practice within, or how do you become the steward of that entire practice? But the other bit that maybe Loop has been doing really interestingly, Carolina, is also kind of making very clear what the kind of rights and what that ownership is, because I guess that's the other thing with what Ben was just mentioning is the thing of like owning the box. I don't like, the box is neither here nor there. It's the film but it's not always clear as the owner of a Matthew Barney piece, or any video. It's not always clear what you actually own. So maybe Carolina, you could kind of pick up on that and talk a little bit about, well, some of the history of that, but also the kind of protocol that you've developed.
Yeah, it's actually really interesting because since the fair was started in 2003, we've seen an evolution, extremely quick evolution in the habits also of collectors towards the acquisition of video works. If at the beginning they were in search for all the insular objects that might accompany the video work, now they grew accustomed to receiving a link, and that link contains the work that they've acquired. So one of the things that we've become increasingly interested in exploring is exactly that. What are you buying when you're purchasing a video work? Is it a package of rights? If it's a package of rights, what are those rights? And how can the transaction be transparent and at the same time guarantees the rights of the artist, but at the same time the rights of the purchaser, be it a private collector or a public institution. And in this sense, we've started a conversation with a lawyer at the beginning, specialized in copyrights, but then also with a wide networks and a growing network of artists, curators, galleries, and collectors interested in discussing these issues. And the conversation came to an end, but actually I considered it a beginning, because I think that the document needs revision and an upload. But it came to an end in 2016 when we published a first proposal for a protocol to buy and sell video art, because of course LUX is also a commercial event. So in a way we experience that friction between the living together of the limited edition model and other ways of distribution. Of course, in our platform, we also have an online streaming platform for which you can access for free most of the videos that were presented at the fair. So we're kind of dealing with two different distribution models. And so we published a contract, a protocol that you can access on our website. And it's basically a one-page protocol that lists all the rights that a purchaser might obtain upon buying a video work. They range between exhibition to communication right, exploitation rights, the possibility to do backup copies of an exhibition, of a video, the possibility to lend, the right to lend that video to third party, being them other private collectors or public institutions. And so even though we don't think that everything is reducible to a one-page document, we felt the need, to put orders to some of the issues around the buying and selling of video work. And that, I think, it's an interesting beginning to a conversation that still needs to, to go on, to be carried on. But of course, for us, is super important the task of, I wouldn't say educating, but create a space for people to really understand the specificity of the medium when it comes to, to its circulation. And I think it's a responsibility that the fair has in this regard.
And how much do you, thinking about obviously the kind of the broader picture slightly, how much do you see that learning and that research and that knowledge that Loop is doing kind of filtering through to other fairs? Or do you see that happening? Do you see, more and more film being shown in fairs, not just as kind of part of a film program or, something that's sort of part of the kind of, let's say, entertainment package of the fair, but as a serious kind of economic or sort of market concern?
I would say that there's a huge difference between how, for example, events like biennales or other festivals treat the exhibition of moving image than other fairs do, because actually we've seen an explosion of moving image being exhibited at biennales or festivals all over the world. Whereas in the last few years, there's an exercise that I do anytime that I go to a commercial fair that is like to count how many videos there are exhibited. And in the last few years, I noted surprisingly that there are less and less. And I'm thinking of commercial fair exhibiting any kind of media. I think that's an issue, but it's also one of the reasons why Loop was born in 2003, because they really felt the need to create a commercial event, a commercial space where moving image could be, exhibited in the way that it deserved, in a way. Because of course, then you ask a gallery who exhibits a video at a standard commercial fair, and it says that it's not really convenient for them to do so, because they probably might not sell it, because probably the visitors who stepped into their booth might only look at photographs or paintings because they don't have time. So that's, I think, I don't know how Ben sees that, but I think that's still an issue.
Yeah, I'm a very optimistic person generally, and but it is true that moving image hasn't really kind of got a huge amount of traction in the commercial market, and actually has been receding a bit. I mean, it does, it is often the first thing to go, in difficult times. So I expect things to be quite bad at the moment. But I just want to, there's some reasons for this, okay? So, a lot of the art market is still driven by the activities of private individuals, okay? So you just have to accept that, and this isn't such a great aspirational world. Let's just still be really clear that the main thing that people collect in the world is paintings of nudes. So things like that is
blue ones.
Yeah, exactly. So it's not like they're arbiters of good taste. They should be left to decide the history of art. So it's true that, like, with the more kind of ephemeral conceptual works, they are primarily collected by institutions. Okay, and I do wonder whether this will ever change, but I'm not sure it will, because I think, if you think about art collecting being driven by how much you can kind of live with, how much you want to live with that artwork. Not many people want to live with films and videos. I know I don't want to after a day at work. And the second thing is about kind of kind of resale value, about work as an investment. And actually there's not much kind of evidence of like a film and video having much of a kind of resale value at the moment. But saying that, now's the optimistic bit. If you're going to talk about art in the last 50 years, you cannot avoid these mediums, as with performance as well. And if you think about collections as a narrative, and fundamentally that's what they are. The history of art is written through collections, whether we like it or not. That is the way it is. So that's why it's so important that this happens, because these will be the story narratives that we leave behind. So that that's the imperative there. And so on the positive side, inevitably institutions, we are seeing more and more engage with these ephemeral art practices, because they are so much of this time, that you cannot ignore them. So firstly, they're so much capture the time that we're in. But the second thing is, as you said, Rose, there are so many artists now whose best work are in these mediums. If you were to engage with somebody like Elizabeth Price, and you didn't want to have any film video, well, that's her best work. I mean, you can't avoid it. So I do feel kind of hopeful for that. But you know, the commercial art market, it will always have limitations. I mean, but a couple of positive things that because I've been around the edge of a lot of these, you know, I get called to speak in a lot of art fairs and things like that, and the collectors that there are, and some of them are very connected to Loop. You know, they are very passionate, you know, but and they have a very particular impetus, I think, which is about which is about patronage, you know, and I think that's a really worthy thing. And patronage has been very important in the history of art, you know, and so I'm kind of hopeful. I'm kind of hopeful for the future that those, you know, there are those kind of impetuses there, you know.
And I think, I mean, certainly with performance exchange, the idea was to create these kind of acquisitions documents around each of the performances, and so that when you were sort of standing in front of the performance, you would literally have something in your hand that said, and this is how you can collect this, whether that is that idea of a package of rights, or whether that is something that more refers to a kind of set of materials, you know, props or scripts or preparation or drawing, or whether it is actually this artist, the performance is something that is not really kind of collectible, but this is how it relates to, you know, a whole bunch of other things that they do. But the whole part of what the kind of job of something like performance exchange is to create that kind of clarity and that kind of confidence around that. And that's partly about the market, but that's also partly about museum curators and people who collect in those spaces, because actually a lot of them don't have the confidence to understand how to do that. And so it's not that you're desperately trying to kind of like, you know, commercialize everything, but you are trying to create a confidence around an understanding of how to go about doing that. And actually I think that kind of relates to Taminga's question, which is in the chat, around kind of this idea of like the relationship between commissioning and acquiring, or thinking about a kind of how a public institution might go about being a producer and then being a collector.
Can I answer Taminga's question, because it's really important. This is a really important point. So that I really want to answer in the very strongest terms. so basically, you know, commissioning and collecting are two different things. Okay, you know, and you know, unless that is kind of agreed at the beginning, you know, I think there are two different economies, and some institutions are, you know, either out of not understanding this thing can kind of overstep the mark with these things, and usually that they would be two separate. They would, unless it's a commission to collect scheme, which they exist, where from the beginning it's understood that a work is being commissioned for a collection. And there are those schemes, like Contemporary Art Society used to run quite a big scheme like that. If it's not that, then it's subject to a different negotiation, you know. And I think there is a bit of institutions have a bit of rights creep sometimes here, you know, in terms of retaining copies and things like that. But it's really, really important that artists, that everybody's clear about this, because the thing with editions, okay, is it's almost like it's like a collective sense of disbelief that we all have to maintain the integrity of these ideas, you know, in a very consistent way, because one of the things that undermines the market is confusion around how these things work, you know. So I think education that's why Loop's work is really important, but because, you know, that gives people kind of confidence, you know, if they understand these things. When people start to talk about like an archive copy or something like that, these are very kind of unclear terms, you know, and that don't really have a meaning in relation to the edition. So I would, you know, my not knowing exactly this case, but I would say those are two separate, you know, they need to be two separate negotiations.
I mean, certainly there's a lot of people, Carolina, that, I mean, I'm thinking of people like Harrow and Harrow Combustion, who in that sense work both as kind of producers of films, and then also the collector of them. And what I've always understood when I've heard Harrow talking about it, for example, is that one option is to say, I'm going to be the producer of this film, and that basically is me supporting the commissioning of this film, and then I will kind of reserve a right to buy an edition of it in the future if that's what I want to do, or that will be something that is built into, you know, part of my kind of, you know, my support as the producer is that I'll get an edition of it. But that clarity at the beginning of what that process is absolutely key to that idea of how it's going to kind of fit together at the end.
Yeah, and actually there are a lot of collectors who are part of the Loop family, as Ben was also saying before, who have evolved from being just collectors to also, you know, patrons or producers. Haro is one case, then Patrizia Sandretto is another case, Han Nefkens is another case, and they all have very different approaches to how they commission, produce, and later relate to the exhibition and distribution of the work they've commissioned. So of course, one option is that you were mentioning, and that Haro was also explaining during a talk that was done at the beginning of this year that you can find online, that's called Buying Time. And he was explaining this option of, specifying since the very beginning that if you as a collector produce a film, that you might have a right to an edition. But then there's also the other model that simply implies that the production. So a collector decides to fully cover the cost of a production of a video, or through a collective effort between private funds and public funds, and then that's its contribution to the development of the artist's work, and that's more of a philanthropic approach to supporting the artist's development and career in a way. So I think that these are two different models, but of course, the agreement has to be very clear since the beginning, because that also affects the way the video is later distributed in the public sphere.
Yeah, no, I think it's really, I mean, certainly I've worked in the past on kind of commissioning to collect projects for museums as well. And it's exactly that. I mean, not only do you have to be clear, you have to be willing to take the risk that, you know, that you don't know at the beginning what the work that you're going to collect is. And so, you know, that's obviously why a lot of people want to kind of do this slightly sort of fudge kind of version of it, but that it ends up being a really difficult situation for both the artist and for the collection in the end, if you're not clear about it, and how that kind of transfers across different kinds of like futures of the work. And I mean, as Ben was saying, I think with both performance and with film and video, this idea of a secondary market, I mean, there have been, I think, very limited kind of auctions of film and video, but obviously there's never been anything around performance. And it's that confidence around not the idea that, you know, kind of like, you know, sort of speculative kind of, you know, this really sort of crazy end of the art market necessarily, but people do want to know that, or think, at least the idea being that if you buy something, you would have an option of reselling it if you were to need to. And all of those things, kind of that lack of clarity and that kind of, oh, well, I think there's another copy floating around here, and I think that you know, it undermines that kind of integrity of the practice, even though, as Ben said, it's kind of like, actually it's a sort of false kind of, it's a false reality anyway. I wanted to ask you both as well about this is sort of a COVID question, but also more generally a kind of digital question around, you know, the presentation of film and video and online, and how you guys have been thinking about that. From my point of view, for Performance Exchange, we were talking about this a tiny bit just before we went online. I've really resisted the idea of kind of thinking about presenting performance online, because I think that unless it's really well done, unless it's really you know, beautifully filmed and really thought through how the camera interacts with that kind of live moment. It's like, it just doesn't work to sort of stick an iPhone camera in a corner of a room and watch a performance. But I wondered what your experience of thinking about this kind of online shift and this kind of digital shift, and whether or not that is something that you see as being a real way of kind of, again, kind of amplifying the circulation and the distribution of film and video.
Shall I start, or do you want? Okay, so I mean, we've been doing a lot of online things, but and it's something that we think about a lot, which is this idea of kind of like primary, like the idea of kind of primary and secondary experiences of things, you know. So we're all about trying to think about the nuance of those, describing those kind of experiences and the quality of those experiences, and they're definitely different. And I would definitely say most of the things we do online are of a kind of secondary nature, unless things are made primarily for the, you know, the kind of online space. So I've been thinking about this for a long time, and I think this kind of question of access is really, really important. You know, so it's really brilliant that people can access things. And I don't think we really have a kind of language to really describe why we struggle with these things, is because, unlike, you know, going back to this kind of question of the auratic encounter again, like how to articulate the difference of the quality of the experience, particularly with film, because culturally, I think we're taught, or for commercial reasons, we're taught that film is infinitely rescalable and transferable between different formats, you know, because basically certain people want to resell those experiences to you across these different platforms. I've often, you know, we're always trying to think of like, well, can we describe film in those auratic terms somehow? Can we describe? And it was kind of like what you were just talking about with the performance as well, that it's like, yeah, this performance is happening in the space, but there is a different charge to it, to being in the space, to just seeing it on your iPhone, you know. And films are the same, I think, as well. You know, there's an intended scale. You know, there's all sorts of qualities to a presentation of something that is not there online, but it's still a very good opportunity to kind of know. I think, what words would I use? Something like experiencing and knowing, or something. There's a difference of those things. So I think it's really, really invaluable. And in terms of what I was talking earlier about the value charge that comes from the knowability of something, if that's a word, that's really, really important, you know, in terms of things being, you know, if things are not visible, then people can't feel passionate about them, they can't write about them, you know. So those things are really important, but I'm very aware of what's not there as well at the same time. So I guess that what we've been doing is a lot of online things, and now we are getting to this more kind of nuanced question of trying to understand, if we are going to be with this online situation longer, how could we start to synthesize our experiences and start to, you know, and really think about what works and what doesn't work in a more kind of nuanced way.
I think this is a preoccupation that we've also had for a long time. It's actually a debate that we started as we were drafting the protocol that we were talking about before, because at the same time we also released a platform that's called Video Club. It's hosted on the same website of the festival, and there you can access, as I was saying before, for free, a selection of video that were presented at the fair. The videos are usually presented in a lower resolution, and possibly, and that's up to the artist, with a watermark, but they're accessible for free, and they're on the platform for an unlimited amount of time. Of course, the artists have the right to retire the video work any time they like. But of course, the idea behind the platform was exactly related with accessibility, and the idea to produce knowledge and criticism around those works, because of course we could say that it's much easier to access a painting or a sculpture if they're reproduced in an art book, whereas it's not the same with a video. So I think it's really important that there is space where artists' rights are protected, but still allows as many people as possible to get to know the work. Then, of course, with the COVID, I think that the debate has grown much stronger, because we've witnessed an overproduction of digital content. And of course, even though we might say the video naturally inhabits the screen, I think that a big problem arose around the publication of moving image online, but then against no remuneration for the artists. So I think it's one of the biggest issues that we as, festival fairs distributors have to face and kind of solve, because I think this is a trend that is not going to stop, the creation and distribution of content online. So we definitely have to find a solution for that. And also, again, trying to educate the audience, but also ourselves as professionals, not to admit that these practices happen. So I think it's a balance between these two realities. But then on the other hand, I also had an experience from the creative side with the art collective that I have in Italy. We do hybrid works between performance and visual arts. And during the quarantine, we were all at home. We were all three in different places, and so we started thinking how we could take advantage of the distance and the screen and the technology that we had, and we created a series of performances involving different artists that were located in Barcelona, in Rome, in Paris, and that were all contributing to create an experience online. And of course that was incredibly interesting, especially because it made us think a lot about technology. I mean, if you want to do these things online, you have to have the resources to do it. You have to have a good technology. And of course, I completely understand you when you say you cannot just put an iPhone and then film a performance in a random space, and that's the experience that you offer about the work. I mean, it poses a lot of question also around the accessibility, the access to technology. Yeah.
I think, the access to technology and particularly, in the UK, obviously, there's huge amounts of conversation around, kind of participation and, giving access to audiences who don't kind of naturally, sort of see themselves as being the consumers of culture, don't naturally go to museums or galleries or whatever. And obviously, I think in some ways, the digital kind of space seems like it gives everybody, quote unquote, access, but actually we also hear how kind of siloed the digital space is. So for me, I always really wonder, like, well, who is it that's actually watching these things, and who is it that's kind of accessing them? Because of course, in theory, they're open to everybody, but actually the way that kind of online marketing works, the way that these kind of digital sort of social like bubbles kind of work, means that in fact it's even more difficult to reach out and to be talking to different kinds of audiences. It feels to me like that would be the case. So we are kind of coming up to an hour. I just wanted to check in and see if there are any sort of final burning questions from our attendees who haven't posed any at the moment, or I'll take that as a no. So I guess I wanted to just very quickly kind of wrap up by asking one final question then, which is the really kind of standard one, and maybe we can kind of format it in the slightly kind of the Ben Cook positive kind of version of it, which is to sort of ask what you see as happening next. I mean, maybe that's also a follow on from this kind of question of the sort of slightly more sort of digital, or kind of like the sort of thinking about maybe a bit more of a kind of mixed reality of things happening in real life and online, and what for your organizations and for the way that you see film and video kind of developing, using this moment, or maybe outside of the kind of COVID problem?
Well, I think just really quickly, this year with the fair, we're already experiencing like a hybrid proposal, because we'll have like the physical fair happening in a museum with a reduced number of galleries, but at the same time, the fair also will be hosted on Artland as an online fair. So there will be 20 galleries only participating physically and the other half only participating online. And I think that's a really interesting model from a commercial point of view to pursue, because I think that the system of fairs as we knew it is not sustainable anymore in terms of the hectic pace that it has, the pressures that it poses on artists, on curators to travel to, and it's not sustainable from a an environmental point of view. So in that way, I think it will be interesting to keep thinking about these hybrid formats. And I think that video is exactly the medium that allows us to do so. But sometimes I wonder what kind of artwork might be cut out of these, digital environment, because of course we talk a lot about video being the perfect medium for the screens, but video can be displayed to different means. So multi-channels installation, it might involve painting, it might involve sculpture, it might involve performance. So what happens to that? And that, I think, it's the biggest questions that we'll have to think about, and that we are as Loop are interested in tackling.
What to say? I don't really kind of have a vision for a kind of technical solution to the future, really. I mean, just to say kind of one thing. I have, we've learned a lot from these last few months. One of the things that we have actually thought about a lot, which has actually been a fundamental change for us, is thinking about these questions of access in really radical ways. So, and actually, if you look on our site at the moment, we're doing a lot of projects around the questions of access as a catalyst for creativity in its own right. So we are leaning very radically into this question of access for the future, and by access I mean in all sorts of ways. But at the moment, in terms of sensory disabilities and things, in terms of like the hard edge of who can't access things like this. So that's been a kind of real. That's been a kind of inspiration. We've really drawn inspiration from that kind of experience, and also just like the access of across geography, across time, of having kids and not being able to go to things, and all of these questions, are so many more people have been able to be in the room in the last few months, which has been really inspiring. I mean, I absolutely agree with what you say, Rose, about this idea of the kind of fallacy of the online common space, that basically we're in a forest looking for a tree. It's just there's too stuff just isn't visible to people. In terms of in terms of what I think about what I'm interested in now, actually, is I'm thinking more kind of politically around these questions, because that seems important at the moment. And I'm actually, I think we're turning back to our radical roots and thinking about how, what's important to us now is to think about how we get back to those impetuses that created this engagement with this medium in the beginning, and the kind of political urgency around those questions of access and community and activism and resistance and things like that. And actually all of those are very much in our DNA. And I think and the thing with film and video and performance as well is that they are very they very much capture this moment. They very much capture and reflect this moment, whereas a lot of more traditional arts can seem sort of irrelevant at the moment, you know, both in terms of capturing the quality of our experience now and reflecting the kind of cultural mediascape that we exist in. So that's my kind of political future.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think I kind of increasingly think about performance exchange as a sort of like almost like a kind of Trojan horse through which you could talk about, you know, these kind of things about like the changing nature of artist practice, but also the changing kind of nature of the urban landscape and like the cost of real estate and how artists make work and how they show work. And, you know, and then you get into the market and it's, you know, the changing nature of global wealth and collecting and, you know, what it means to kind of expand collections, not only to include new kind of materials, but also think about the diversity of artists, and that all of these things can actually be kind of like drawn into something that seems like a kind of relatively simple question of like, how do you collect a performance? It actually asks, well, why do you need to, and who gets to, and those questions, if anything, feel like they're becoming, you know, more kind of like pertinent as we go through this moment than
absolutely. I mean, I think about these kind of questions that you're engaged with as actually like picking at the threads of this whole of the whole kind of edifice of these institutions in some ways, you know. And I think that's why many artists became interested in working with moving image at the beginning, and performance is, by its, as you know, by its very nature, its kind of slipperiness is something that's very attractive to people, you know, and it has this kind of radical potential within its form, you know, to, you know, despite the institution, you know, the amazing institutional machine that manages to kind of institutionalize everything, including its own critique. There's still some glimmer of resistance in the awkwardness, you know, in the like the awkwardness of these things, which I think are very, you know, awkward things are really important and powerful, you know.
I feel like that's the perfect place to leave it then. So thank you both so much. That's been really, really interesting. I feel like it's one of those conversations where you could probably spend an hour talking about like a whole, like each of those threads, as you've just said, but we will leave it there. So, but thank you very much. And thank you to everybody kind of offering questions and comments. Just to say that this will be also kind of archived online with as a part of our joint archive with the project, the talks that we've been doing with David Roberts. They have another talk, the details of which have not been released to me yet, coming up next Thursday at 5 o'clock. So look out on social media for details of that. And then we, Performance Exchange, will be back in a couple of weeks with some things more about kind of performance histories, I think. Thank you, Benjamin, and thank you, Carolina. It's been really, really interesting, and see you soon.